Hi, everybody. This is Warren Herman. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to speak about the subject of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a subject that is very sensitive for many people. Many people in the world have extensive wounds that they have experienced in their lives, and there's a necessity for finding ways to achieve forgiveness, to receive this grace, to be able to let things go and live again. So tonight we're going to go through, hopefully, a very quick outline of the different elements that are necessary for understanding the process of forgiveness. One of the things I really want to focus on in this video is a unified model of how we cope with any kind of challenge. There's different metaphors that I've used in the past. Some of you who are familiar with my videos on scrupulosity will recognize various elements of the approach that I'm going to share today in this video, because the approach is largely similar, but it's tailored to the understanding of this other kind of interior challenge. It's using the similar methods, but uses them in this different context. So I really want to focus on some of these techniques and to introduce a model that I've used in various ways. But I think I have to begin at the beginning and to just give us an outline of what's going to be included in this video. There is no way, of course, that I can cover the detail necessary to really give each one of these elements a worthy treatment in this one video. So I'm just going to go real quick. The first thing we really have to understand if we want to forgive is we have to understand what forgiveness is and what it is not. There are many things that we could say about what forgiveness is not. For example, there's a distinction between forgiving and saying it's okay that something bad happened. There's a distinction between forgiving and reconciling with those who've harmed us in different situations. There are many different distinctions that have to be made, or else forgiveness can seem like an impossible feat. Especially one of the important distinctions is that forgiveness is not necessarily about feeling that there's no trauma left over from the hurt, or just forgiveness is not just feeling warm fuzzy feelings about the people who hurt us. It's an act of the will. And that brings us to this idea of what is forgiveness. Forgiveness is something we do. And there's different ways that we could describe it. I like two different ways to describe it. And one is these three interrelated ideas, and another one is 7 steps. So the three interrelated ideas, you could say that forgiveness is about a kind of a union with Christ. We're not alone, but with Christ. That's part of it. And that could be one way of looking at it. Another way of understanding forgiveness, another facet of this, is seeing the mercy of God in everything, including the bad things that have happened to us, including these things we're trying to forgive in some ways. This is a strange way of looking at things. I grant that. The other element is to share God's mercy. So it's about being with Christ, being with the merciful Christ, not being alone by being with the merciful Christ. It's about being able to see the mercy of God in everything and being able to share the mercy of God with everyone. This is one way of talking about forgiveness. But I think a much more accessible understanding of forgiveness that could be much more practical for people is what I might call the 7 steps of forgiveness. What's really important to understand in these 7 steps is that this is how we do it. This is how we forgive. This is how you know you've forgiven, I think. And what's really important to understand is that the more essential to forgiveness the step is, the higher up on the list it is. And I would say that the most essential thing on the list of forgiveness is, first of all, if you've resented somebody and you have this resentment and you've been entertaining that, you go to confession. That's how you deal with it. And then when they offer up the Mass, you offer up the Mass for the person who hurt you, or include them among the people who you're offering up that Mass for. So I think that that's really important because it shows us that the essential act of being a human is sacramental. And that's the most important thing we could do, to know that we've forgiven. That's the most essential element of forgiveness, is that sacramental level of forgiveness. The next level down from that's next level most essential from that, is the level of prayer. Of course, the sacraments include prayer, but they also include the direct operations of God. And that's why they're higher up on our list. But prayer is really important, and praying for those who've harmed us is that really good indicator of forgiveness. That's a very good indicator there. There's also the necessity of willing the good of the other, or doing certain things that are positive for that person, using our will in that regard. And then there's also working through the negative thoughts we have, questioning those negative thoughts about the person. That's also important. And then we also have, maybe you could do things where you imagine forgiving the person, imagine, various processes to kind of work through the feelings, like imagining doing that. And there's also that necessity of paying attention to the present moment, letting the past be the past and living in the moment. So these are all, as we work down through the human faculties, from that sacramental level to the level of the heart, to the level of the prayer, we could also include relational acts, after the prayer, like how to maybe we have to say we're sorry, we have to do relational things. Then we have to change what we will. We have to change what we think. We have to change how we imagine. We have to change how we pay attention. So there's all these different levels. But from the most essential, so sacramental, prayer, relational, will, thinking, imagining, attention. These are the levels, and they're, as you go up to the top, it's more essential to what forgiveness is. Like, it's more essential to go to confession to get rid of the resentment, and then offer up the Mass for that person, than it is to necessarily imagine forgiving the person. It's just, that's higher up on the list. That's more essential to the act itself. And what's important about this is, so it shows us how we could do this. How do we do this action? And it's very important to know how we can do this, and all the different aspects of it. And it really shows also that this is distinct from the passions, because the other level would be, not feeling, if we go into the passions, be like, okay, is forgiveness not feeling anything about the event? No? Is forgiveness feeling warm, fuzzy feelings, being drawn toward the person who did something? No? So those are even less essential to the thing. So that's not what forgiveness is. So it's looking at those faculties, those about sacramental, prayer, relational, thinking, willing. Let's see, let's count them up. Thinking, willing, imagining, attention. So it's about it's about 7. So that's the levels. So what I want to really go into now is this understanding that when we forgive, generally there's 2 principles. One of these principles is the idea that we want to give people the benefit of the doubt, and if we can't give people the benefit of the doubt, we want to say that they were, the temptation was strong. That's kind of the way it's traditionally phrased. Or we could also say they lack skills, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So we want to give the judgment of charity, and that helps us in our process of forgiveness. But in different situations, we may have to do that in different ways. And there also are ways in which we may have to judge actions at times. We may have to say, okay, so it is wrong that the person stole your car, but we would say, but the temptation must have been great. That's kind of how you would deal with that. We want to understand that a lot of times what happens is that, forgiveness often involves relationships where we are close to people. And, there's many ways in which we really want to understand, forgiveness of individual people or groups. And the thing is that we really want to move away from black and white thinking to complexity type thinking. We want to be able to see what's going on a lot of times rather than thinking that someone is perfect or or terrible. We want to humanize people rather than angelize or demonize them. Usually, that seems to be a good idea. Of course, there's many saints that'll give us advice on kind of really looking up to others, seeing the best in others. But I think that sometimes these things are similar to different remedies that we might have when someone has a different kind of a conscience. So for some individuals, their psychological makeup may require different medicines. So for some people, it may be better, this is my guess, that it may be better for people in some circumstances with certain personality patterns to generally give everybody the benefit of the doubt. And those are people who, tend toward anger all the time, in a certain way, or they tend toward judgmental things. But people who are exceedingly patient may need to, in some ways, be more truthful in their understanding of things. And, because there may be some legitimate reasons for that, because they may end up in dangerous situations if they don't do that, or situations that will make problems. So there may be some things like that. But overall, there needs to be a shift toward where we're humanizing other people. We need to be shifting toward a humanizing way of doing things. We need to be humanizing others rather than demonizing them. That's certain. So what does this look like? Well, a lot of times when we have an initial attachment to a person in any situation, we often think that person is perfect. Then something happens and trust is broken, or something happens in a relationship, and then the person is viewed as terrible. And so what we want to do is we want to shift from this all good, all bad to there's good and bad in there. Rather than black and white, there's all these different colors. We want to see all these different elements. And so this is really important. There are ways, of course, when it gets more complex when you're dealing with groups. And this means rather than saying, okay, this group is all bad or all good, we might need to look at the different elements of this group or the individual. We might want to see the interrelated ways in which they have spiritual elements, human elements, and then dysfunctional elements, and see how they all support each other or interrelate. That's much more complicated than they're good or they're bad. We might be able to look at generations inside of a group and be like, okay, well, the first generation has this positive, negative, quality matrix, and the next generation has this that's based off of that, and the third generation has this, and this is how they all interact. And you see a much more complex picture of interaction that explains why there's different dynamics. And so you need to go into this, you want to be able to go into this in a more complex way rather than like, it's all good, it's all bad. This can be useful in certain ways, certain parts of the healing process. So that, I think, is very important. So I think that's going to be a good thing to keep in mind when we think about the necessity of forgiveness. So another thing to note when we think about forgiveness is this idea that there are, again, there's forgiving others as a primary thing and a primary focus of this, but there's also a necessity of forgiving ourselves. And the thing is that it's very interesting. I think there's really not much said about self-forgiveness in the spiritual literature of the Catholic Church because I think it's found under other headings. For example, I think there's things about being patient with yourself, and I think there are things about humility that overlap with what today we would call self-forgiveness and compassion. Because I think that this ability to forgive ourselves is the same thing as realizing our littleness and having compassion for our littleness rather than out of pride attacking ourselves for wishing we had done better. And so, because knowing that we were the way we were and having empathy for that is, I think, deeply related to humility. And so that, I think, is very important to realize that self-forgiveness and self-compassion can be legitimate, and I think are importantly included in any treatment of that we would talk about in how do we forgive others, because many times we're upset with ourselves as well and feel devalued and feel unworthy. And an ability to have love for ourselves and know that we are loved is also essential to forgiveness, because a lot of times when we're hurt by someone, it's because we are making them into the source of love, rather than realizing that we are loved by God, and that, and that even no matter how bad we are, we can be understood, and there could be compassion for us. And that, I think, is deeply important. Now we're going to come to the meat of this video. The meat of this video is what we can do when it seems like forgiveness is not working. Of course, we have to take those 7 steps that we mentioned before. Sacramentally dealing with the thing, praying about it, doing relational acts, willing the good of the other, trying to work through our negative thoughts, imagining forgiveness, being in the moment with our attention. These are all different parts of the way that we can deal with this. But, and most essentially is the sacramental and the prayer and all that. But the most important thing we could do also, after we've done that, is how do we face the aftermath of the constant replays, the constant resentments, the different things that pop into our mind after we've forgiven something? Why, how do we deal with these things that come into our head, whether we want them or not? And this is going to be, the first time I introduced this paradigm in this way, we could talk about this, the sword and the shield. In my old language for this used to be the dragon and the tiger. But we'll use the sword and shield analogy in this one just to kind of introduce it as well. You see, when we are dealing with these replays, and that's what I'll call it, the problem is you forgive and then you have replays. And how do we deal with the replays, which are destroying our lives? How do we deal with that? Well, the most important thing that you could do is you want to use the sword first. The sword cuts through stuff so that you don't have to take the hits and be beaten up by it. So the sword allows us to work through things in a certain way. And the number one thing that this begins with, if you want to think about a sword, if you look at it, it has kind of like 4 points. It has the tip, it's kind of the 2 points of the handle, and the point on the end. So there's 4 points to the sword method. And the number one thing is this idea that we want to have accurate knowledge of what's going on. And in the case of forgiveness, we want to have an accurate understanding of why we are having replays in our mind. Why is this happening? The actual way in which this is happening is deeply important to understand, because if you think the reason why you're having these replays is because something is wrong with you and you don't forgive and you're going to go to hell and this is terrible, then this lack of accurate knowledge is going to lead to forgiveness being something that you're stuck on, because you're going to be so horrified by all the thoughts popping into your head and nothing's going to seem to be working, and this is going to be pretty bad. So you're going to need to have some ways to cut through to accurate knowledge about the situation. And these are, so we're going to talk about this. So for example, it's important to know that it's normal when you have strong emotions for something to replay in your head. There's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't mean anything. And even just on a simple level, understanding the phases of consent to sin. That's one way we can have accurate knowledge. We can know, okay, just the fact that something is suggested and pops into our mind doesn't mean it's something terrible, that we've sinned and we've really meant that thought. Just even knowing that is, important. And realizing that the movements, you will have the movements of the mind will go toward, you'll have the thought pop in your head, the movement of anger, the appetite of anger will attach to it, but yet that is not consent of the will. And so knowing that, you can say, okay, a lot of times these things that pop in your head are not sins. They're nothing to worry about. Just keep going. Keep living life. Don't worry about it. The other thing is to understand, understand the phases of consent to sin, or understanding the mitigating factors for mortal sin. So, for example, let's say you're sitting there and you're not really aware of what you're doing, and all of a sudden you're thinking, think it's something bad about a person. That is something that you can realize you're having that sin, but you didn't have full consent. You didn't have sufficient reflection that you were doing it. Maybe you consented to it, but you didn't realize that you were even doing it. You kind of got off track. You were daydreaming. You didn't really know what was going on. you were thinking about something neutral, and then all of a sudden you found, oh, why am I thinking that? There's things like that. You can have lack of sufficient reflection. That's another way you can dismiss these things so you don't make too much of a big deal about them and get yourself so agitated that this starts to get inflamed. It becomes like an ingrained and inflamed element of your consciousness. You don't want that to happen. So there's elements like that. Or you can understand, okay, obviously you're dreaming, you're half asleep. These are mitigating factors for the arising of resentful thoughts. Even sometimes, it's hard in these type of situations. There's traditionally strong emotion is something that's said to mitigate culpability. But it's hard to, necessarily use that criteria in this scenario. But I guess somebody more experienced with that criteria could make that argument. I'm not sure how to apply it here. Obviously, you could say that great anger might excuse the thoughts you had, but that would seem, that's kind of seems a little iffy in my mind. Because obviously anger is the thing we're trying to avoid. The sin of anger is we're trying to avoid sinful anger anyway in this situation. So it's hard to use anger as an excuse for anger. But those are some ways. We want to understand the ways to either notice where there's no sin in these suggestions, and notice why there is, or where there's only venial sin, so we don't overemphasize these things. And realize that if we get into overemphasizing these things, you also can have amplification and rumination. So you could be so afraid of committing a sin of resentment or unforgiveness that you can be looking for this, and then when it pops into your mind, there's greater amplification and focus and almost pain when that thought comes in than would ordinarily be there. And then when you see the appetites move toward it, you really flinch even at the appetites, and so really you get a really good apparent consent. It really looks like you consented, and then you ruminate and say, I guess I really did think that resentful thought. I'll never be able to forgive. I'm going to go to hell. You think all that stuff. So there can be, if you don't use those other techniques, you can get into this inflamed situation where you can have some trouble with that. And so having accurate knowledge about all those things can really be helpful to understand what's going on in your mind. And what's really important here is, we can understand, we mentioned before the idea of, different types of, we mentioned, there's different types of forgiveness, like self-forgiveness and other forgiveness. And sometimes we can have replays in our mind because something goes against our identity. We're so harmed. We have such a feared self that maybe I'm a terrible person, or maybe I'm crazy, or maybe I imagined everything. Maybe I did something terrible and embarrassing by getting mad at somebody, because we start to doubt our perceptions for various reasons. And so we can have that great fear that we've done something terribly wrong. And maybe in some ways we've done wrong things. That's not to say that we haven't. But we could have that fear can be so intense that the replay is not due to resentment, but due to almost like an obsessive fear, almost like an OCD checking of the doorknob of, did I do something terrible? And so sometimes we can misinterpret this kind of need to protect, to not be this feared self, and this replaying that the brain does to try to sort that out as resentment. And then that makes us say that we're resentful people, and that gives us more reason to think we'll never forgive, and then we get upset with that. And so it's really important to realize that can happen. And this is something that is kind of based off the ideas, and this is not a therapy video, this is not any medical advice, but this is based off of a certain therapy called ICBT, which is inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy, and involves this idea of the feared self. And that feared self, in this case, I'm a terrible person. Did what I do not make any sense? Am I the bad guy? All these kind of thoughts that we might have make us replay the situation, and we have to realize that that's what's driving this. That's what's driving the replays. And sometimes it's not a resentment per se. It's more of a replay because we're afraid of being something bad. And obviously, again, self-compassion is important there, realizing that it's not the end of the world if we are bad, being open to that in a sense, and maybe also realizing that maybe we do have a misperception. So it can be both. The solution could be both being able to accept being bad and also realizing that maybe we weren't as bad as we think. So those both can be useful there. So that's also another reason why we could be having replays. Another thing that's very important is to understand the role of what's called cognitive dissonance and how that can make obsessive replays as well. This is found in teachings. It was given in this workshop I took by this lady, and there were various other presenters that were there, and they spoke about the problematic love relationships. They did many different things. This was a PESI training, which was called narcissistic and psychopathic abuse training. So it had a lot of good stuff in that training. There were many good presenters in there. And again, this is not a video. That is not official therapy. This is just for educational purposes and my own life experience and just sharing stuff like that has been helpful to me. These videos really showed some really important things, because sometimes what can happen is we can end up with these kind of replays in our mind because we can be almost unable to figure out, we can be almost unable to understand what we're looking at. If we, this one video talks about how in some relationships, because people are so skilled at being understanding, they end up squaring the circle, so to speak, of a person who is, has some type of a personality issue. They're not making sense, but we make sense of them, and eventually we lose touch with reality because we have this capacity to really understand and empathize and commit. And what happens is we start making sense of something, in these situations, that they describe. We start making sense of something that doesn't make sense, and then we lose touch with our ability to make sense of things. And so that is this description of cognitive dissonance, which is in some relationships that could be traumatic in different ways. This can be a very pervasive symptom and could lead, they said, to, I think it was up to 1 to 3 years impairment in executive functioning, which could make people lose their jobs. They just have these kind of replays and they can't make sense of things, and it feels like they have OCD because their brain just keeps replaying everything because it can't make sense of what happened because of how much the people have had like this kind of allegiance and this loyalty, and were making sense of things that, in different ways weren't making sense in these relationships. They end up with this thing that breaks their mind and leads to more replays. And so it's another source of replays that when we understand that this symptom can be normal, especially in very complex relationships, especially in a relationship where a person is not necessarily, a person who has normal traits, but occasionally gets mad or something and makes a resentment, but in a relationship where the person has different traits that are missing. And they give examples like this, for example, like narcissistic personality disorder. Sometimes, there could be sometimes people mentioning in these situations, autism could be mentioned as well. Obviously psychopathic or sociopathic situations, but anytime when someone is lacking skills or traits that in a pervasive way, sometimes this type of thing can come up to one degree or another. Because when someone is lacking skills, we kind of maybe make excuses and then we lose the ability to understand what we're looking at. And, in more problematic situations, there could even be things like gaslighting going on, which further makes the person lose touch with reality. And the person is kind of, suggesting that it's your problem. And then you start to lose touch with whose problem is what. And it starts to flip around. And, these type of situations can make the person really lose touch with reality. But it's because the person is so agreeable, so has such high skills, which made them really successful in other areas of their lives. And it's really an amazing thing to understand this, because you then can understand why the replays are happening in your mind. And that's another reason. So the thing is cognitive dissonance, trying to make sense of what didn't make sense, and then being like, wait, or the gaslighting. These elements can also make replays because we can start doubting our perception. And, all these things can become kind of doubting diseases. And that could be why these replays are coming up, and not necessarily just because there's a complete resentment. Of course, in situations, now if we move on to situations of abuse and neglect and so on and so forth, there can be situations where now we just have a PTSD flashback, where it's just something that's terrifying and scary, and the brain is trying to make sense of, hey, we want to keep you safe. Hey, remember that? Like, oh, triggers, remember that, remember this. It's not necessarily a resentment, it's a defense mechanism. It's trying to keep you safe because, okay, whenever you go see that house, you flinch because you don't want to be, you don't have a bad memory. You have a bad memory of that, So because your brain's trying to keep you safe. So sometimes it's not that you have a resentment. It's that you just have a trauma. You just have a complete trauma, in like a domestic violence situation or something like that. So it's just a traumatic, memory or something that's just trying to keep you safe. It's not that you're remembering it on purpose in order to be resentful. It's just that you're traumatized. So that's another important thing to remember, so we don't make an unnecessary meaning out of these symptoms that then irritates them further. Because the whole thing is, a lot of these things are all, if we want to have accurate knowledge, they're all ways that the brain is perceiving danger. They're all, as Dan Buglio says, perceived danger symptoms. They're all just different kinds of perceived danger symptoms. They're like, not understanding ourselves, not being able to make sense of others, making sure that we're safe. Like, all these things are like, there's always some type of danger, like, ooh, maybe they're bad, or maybe I'm bad, or like this I can't be bad, they can't be bad, oh no, I don't want to be in a bad situation again. Like, all this stuff is, all these things are perceived danger symptoms, and they're not necessarily always a resentment. They're not always an active resentment. And when we realize what they are, we just don't make excessive meaning out of these things, and then we can better just kind of be instantaneously freed from these things. And that's why I'm mentioning this. This whole thing is all different ways that we can have accurate knowledge, and that's that first step on that side of this method, which is called the sword method. The first step is to have accurate knowledge. The second step is to, we want to notice that the truth of this. We want to notice that this accurate knowledge is true. So I'm going to give some examples of this. Like, so you might want to, Dan Buglio does things where you take assessments, for example, to see whether you have, this approach is he uses this approach for kind of mind-body medical conditions. This is related to his approach, I should say. There's elements that come from different thinkers in various ways you'll see in these things. It's probably too much to go into to say where all this comes from. It's kind of an organization of many different approaches. But there's this real necessity that when you have to notice that it's true, that this is what's going on for you. You have to see that it's true. You have to see that it's not that you're being resentful. It's not that you're doing something wrong. You have to, you have to be able to kind of see this. And if you're in any doubt, one of the good principles that comes from, kind of the confessional area, in mortal sin, they have this phrase for the scrupulous, which says, when in doubt, it doesn't count. If you have a doubt about whether you committed a mortal sin, you are free to act as if you haven't, and that's how it works when you're trying to recover from scrupulosity. And this can be also applied, I think, to any of these areas. When in doubt, it doesn't count. When you're kind of realizing that, like, oh, well, maybe I'm a terrible person, or maybe I'm terrible, and like, and I'm the terrible person. When in doubt, it doesn't count. Like, maybe every single thing the other person did is perfect, and I'm the worst person. When in doubt, it doesn't count. Maybe, like, when you realize, yeah, this is trauma, this is that. It's not that I'm resentful. When you have any doubt that whether you've deliberately had a resentful thought, it doesn't count. So these are things. So when these thoughts are coming up, you want to use when in doubt, it doesn't count, or noticing noticing your doubts, or noticing the proof that it's the other way. And noticing is something I got from, I don't necessarily recommend that people watch his videos only because of some of the language that's in them, and some of the spiritual traditions are different than things I would endorse. But there's some good things that come out of, there's some good and useful ideas that come out of the work, that are very helpful in the work of Dr. David Snyder. And some of these ideas come from his things, because he talks about things in conversational hypnosis, and this actually works the same way for our own minds. As he talks about noticing things, or then using logic and then using meaning. And so he speaks about these things, but it's very important to realize, you can use logic. Well, it's normal to you could use logic, saying, oh yeah, it's normal that given the experiences I went through, it's normal to have flashbacks. That doesn't mean I'm resenting it on purpose. Using logic, or noticing that it's just involuntary things popping in. Oh, that means that it's not a resentment. That means I didn't deliberately resent the person. That just means it popped in. So that's meaning. Like, okay, because I wasn't thinking it adequately through, that means I wasn't actively mortally sinful in resenting that person. You can use these techniques, which are accurate knowledge. I got that from Dan Buglio. Noticing, logic, and meaning. Like, this means that, or using like a reasoning, phrase. You can use these different methods to try to, kind of cement this accurate knowledge. And that's the SWORD approach. It's those 4 points of accurate knowledge. The other thing that we want to do is and this is much more closely related to the 4 steps of OCD from Dr. Schwartz, but primarily to the DARE response. This is a popular method of dealing with anxiety. And we have to understand that, ultimately what we want to do is live our lives. The final step of the 4 steps of OCD and of the DARE response is an idea of engaging in life. It's not all about correcting our symptoms. It's about being in the flow of life. It's about living the life we would have if we didn't have the issue or the symptom. So, I'm going to rephrase some of the DARE response steps because I think it's better to use other words, but I'll use some elements. The first thing is to be indifferent or unbothered by the symptom. And the DARE response counsels us to use this idea, so what? So what? There's this way in which we might want to say, so what? To ourselves. And that's the attitude that we want to have toward whatever symptom we have, toward the resentments that come up, toward those waves of the issue that arise. We want to have that, so what? We also can have, that's allowed to be here. This attitude of allowing. We're accepting, we're allowing it. And then we might want to, as they say in the DARE response, to run toward, or say, bring it on. We have to directly desire disturbance. And it doesn't make sense to try to have resentful thoughts. It doesn't make sense, but we have to desire the pain of them. If we intend the pain and intend the disturbance, that's licit. And that allows us to use this kind of indirect resistance. We desire the disturbance of the emotional pain and the mental pain. And by desiring the disturbance directly, kind of disarm this cycle of avoidance, and we kind of break out of things. And so that's the way or bring it on. We could kind of say to ourselves, more pain, bring it on, pain, more pain. Try to hurt me, we could kind of do that. We can kind of talk to our thoughts, not like in a way that, not in a way that kind of like we're debating them or weirdly talking to them, or to our emotions or something like that. We could talk to the pain, but come on, hurt me. That's a way we can do it. Another, thing we could say about this, and just as a side note, is that this is a very good, interesting Franciscan paradigm. We kind of are talking to brother feelings or brother thoughts. That's kind of a way of thinking about it. And so it situates itself nicely within a Franciscan paradigm of reality. That I think it's very interesting to notice that how this talking to ourselves is really well situated within specifically this Catholic and Franciscan context of this broader picture of reality and the brotherhood and sisterhood of all things under the fatherhood of God. this kind of poetic, this poetic speech toward our thoughts and our feelings situates itself nicely underneath the prayerful speech to God and to the saints and so on and so forth. Because we can see this poetic speech, like in Saint Francis, he's calling brother sun, sister moon, brother dog, all these different things. So I think it's just a very interesting element that these dare response steps are well grounded in this Franciscan paradigm. And I think that it's interesting to note as well that there is this we went through the dare response. So these steps are, so what? It's allowed to be here, more of this, and then engage. And so we understand this is the shield, and it goes with the sword. So basically the sword was accurate knowledge, notice the truth, try to notice the truth of that, try to use logic, use like statements like this means this, try to convincing yourself that that's the sword method. And we also have, the shield method, which is the dare response, which is so what? It's allowed to be here, more of this, just engage in your life, live your life. And again, this is about living life, and it fits nicely into the spiritual traditions, the mystical life in the Eastern and Western churches. All this fits in with this because it really connects to things like, when Jesus talks in the scriptures, he says, when you pray, go into your inner room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who is in secret will reward you. It's more or less what he says, I think. And in this thing, we can find some psychological analogies by saying, okay, go into your inner room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who's in secret. That means what we're doing is we're trying in all these things to kind of shut the door on our unconscious mind and then live our life with God, live our life of love for God and neighbor. Go into our inner room, pray to your Father who's in secret, not get caught up, in all those things in the outer rooms of our house, all these things in our all these resentments in our unconscious mind, and all these things. We want to live that life. We don't want these thoughts to be coming in. We want to shut the door on them. And this is beautifully stated in the Western spiritual tradition in the book, The Cloud of Unknowing, which encourages us to put all these concerns under the cloud of forgetting and knock with a single prayer on what they call the cloud of unknowing, on that, the fact that we don't know, we know that by faith God is there, so we pray to him. That's how I'm interpreting the language here. So we pray to him. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to live a life of love. We're trying to engage in love. We're trying to pray for those who persecute us. We're trying to pray for everyone. We're trying to love God. We're trying to live a life, live and love. That's what we're trying to do. And put all the other things under a cloud of forgetting. Forgive and forget. We want to live out this. And these steps allow us to kind of put our unconscious mind back to sleep, in a sense. These thoughts that keep coming back, after we've made it an act of forgiveness and a commitment to forgiveness and are committed to a lifestyle of forgiveness. These thoughts that keep coming back are also discussed in the Eastern spiritual tradition among those thoughts that are called logismi, like the different thought forms that come in to our minds, this is when in the Eastern tradition they're praying the Jesus prayer, like, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the different thoughts are trying to get their attention away. And this is what it's like. We're trying to live a life with God. We're trying to live life with God. And these flashbacks, these different things are trying to come in. But we have to understand what these things are. We have to not give them, so to have accurate knowledge, know what they are, so that we can forget about them. Because even in the teachings on, the 4 steps of OCD, they talk about revaluing these things, realizing that they're not important. Reinterpreting this stuff. Okay, that's just a component. That's just a That's just a compulsion, or in our case here, that's just a flashback. That's just a just cognitive dissonance. That's just a replay because I'm afraid that I'm bad. We kind of know what's going on rather than saying, "Oh, I'm a resentful person. I'm a terrible person," and getting all inflamed about it. We know what it is, so we can kind of work through it. And this connects deeply to that spiritual tradition, that anthropology of the Eastern and Western mystical traditions, and as we saw in that scriptural passage as well. So this really situates itself well within the Christian tradition of forgiving and forgetting, and that's very important because we have to understand how our minds work, and I'm really understanding um, because we can't control the movements in ourselves. We only can control that inner part of ourselves. And that's what really kind of brings us full circle back to what forgiveness is and what it's not, back to those understandings of our faculties that we discussed, those 7 steps at the beginning. It shows, okay, like the main thing is that life, sacrament, and prayer. And all these other things are kind of lowered down on the rungs of our human nature we have less control over. So we want to be living that out so that we can forgive and forget, not worry as much about those lower elements and focus on those higher things so that we can really be living out what forgiveness is. And of course, there are places in, we have to make decisions on how do we make amends for what we've done wrong in situations. We have to try to do that in a way that makes sense and has a good impact and repairs the wrongs we've done. But that's beyond what forgiveness is in itself. We could also think about reconciling with the people, to what extent it makes sense, but that goes beyond what forgiveness is. But this video, I hope, provides a kind of a comprehensive framework of a lot of different elements that are related to forgiveness, and introduces especially those elements of that sword and shield method to really go through how we understand what's going on, so that we really can make some headway in understanding practically how to forgive and how to live this out in our lives. So we're going to pray to Saint Maria Goretti, and we'll invoke her, and we could invoke actually her attacker, I believe Alessandro. We can invoke both of them, because of his repentance. There's devotion to him as well. So we can invoke their prayers, as we say, Saint Maria Goretti, pray for us. Alessandro Serenelli, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks for listening.